Welcome. This webinar is part of our educational series called Clinical Trials Explained: Know Your Options. Our goal with the series is to help patients, caregivers, and families better understand clinical trials so they can feel informed, empowered, and confident when exploring their options. So far in this series, we've covered the foundations of clinical trials, how research advances into patient care, how to use TriCan's platform to find clinical trials that may be a good fit, and current clinical trials right here in Michigan. Today, we're taking the next step, focusing on how to actually navigate the process. We'll walk through what to ask your doctor, how eligibility works, what to prepare, and what to expect when considering or enrolling in clinical trials. A few quick housekeeping notes. All attendees will be muted and video will be off for the duration of this program. Please feel free to insert questions in the chat at any time. This session is also being recorded so it can be shared with others who may benefit. My name is Annie Dalton Flores. I'm the Executive Director of Sky Foundation. I'm joined by Jamie Geyer, our business manager, who is behind the scenes and happy to help if anyone on this webinar needs help with connection. She will share her information in the chat if she hasn't already. Sky Foundation is a Michigan-based nonprofit organization founded by pancreatic cancer survivor Sheila Sky Castleman. Sky raises awareness and funds innovative research for the early detection and treatment of pancreatic cancer. But what makes Sky's role especially important is that we fund what's called seed grants in pancreatic cancer research. Every clinical trial, every new treatment, every advancement you hear about begins as research. And at Sky Foundation, we're proud to help fund those early ideas, planting the seeds that allow promising discoveries to grow into clinical trials. But once those trials exist, the next step becomes just as important, helping patients actually find them and understand how to take part. Because access isn't just about availability, it's about awareness and navigation. As a Michigan-based organization, we're not only focused on funding research, we're focused on making sure patients here know what options are available to them, especially within their own communities. Patients shouldn't have to search endlessly or feel overwhelmed trying to figure out where to start. We're helping bridge the gap between research and real-world access, making sure patients and families understand how to discover clinical trials, evaluate if they're a good fit, and confidently take the next step towards enrollment. We are incredibly grateful to partner with TriCan Health on this educational series. I'd now like to turn it over to Kimya Harris, co-founder of TriCan Health. Kimya, welcome.
Thank you, Annie. It's such a pleasure to be here, and we are honored to be co-sponsoring this webinar series. I am the CEO and co-founder of TriCan Health, and TriCan Health exists for one simple reason, and that is we want to make sure that every patient with cancer has access to the potentially life-saving treatments available through clinical trials. And as Annie said, this is episode 4, so I'm hoping for those of you that have been with us from the start that you now know and are more familiar with clinical trials. But for those who don't, clinical trials are where every new drug is tested. And that means that all of the advanced treatments of tomorrow, the targeted therapies, the vaccine therapies, all the exciting new immunotherapies, those are only available today in clinical trials. And so by participating in a clinical trial, patients can get access to tomorrow's advanced medicines today. But so many patients don't know that clinical trials are a therapeutic option for them. They don't know how to find them, how to understand them. And that is what we want to change. TriCan Health wants to make it easier for patients to find trials, to learn about them, to understand the language in them, and to talk to their doctors about them. And we're starting our work in pancreatic cancer because pancreatic cancer is still a cancer where there is so much room for improvement, really. And this work is very personal for me. It comes from my personal experiences and from my professional experiences. So I am a cancer researcher and drug development. I started with a PhD at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and have stayed in the field ever since. And that experience with drug development and research formed the basis for my wanting to start TriCan. But what was probably even more important was my personal experience. I have faced a cancer diagnosis twice myself. I was diagnosed with breast cancer in my 30s 2 times. And at the same time, I watched my mom battle her diagnosis with pancreatic cancer. And those experiences are really what drove me to want to start TriCan and really help patients and their caregivers. But while I had all this experience in oncology and cancer, I did not have any experience in software or how to build a platform to, bring the information that patients need to them. And for that, I relied on my co-founder, Mike Harris.
Thanks, Kimya. I had spent my career focused in the technology world. So I was actually helping large enterprises like Chrysler Corporation at the time actually develop their data center networks and understand how to connect things, how to use artificial intelligence effectively, how to communicate all around the world. And when Kimya wanted to create a way to help as many patients as possible find and connect to clinical trials, I was able to help bring that vision to life by building a platform to make that possible. And what we've done, and we'll show you later in this webinar, is a way for every patient, every clinician to find the best match clinical trial based on the particular circumstance of the diagnosis and prior treatments and so forth, and then make a quick connection to identify with the oncologist if that trial is in fact a good fit. So we'll go through that later today, but it's a pleasure to have that opportunity to speak with you all now.
Thank you so much, Mike and Kimya. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Presenting first will be Dr. Philip Phillip. He is a nationally recognized leader in pancreatic cancer and a gastrointestinal oncology, serving as chair of hematology and oncology at Henry Ford Cancer Center and professor at Wayne State University. He has led numerous clinical trials and plays a key role in advancing new treatment options for patients through research and innovation. Next, we will have Laura Wood speak. She is an oncology nurse with over 35 years of experience supporting patients in clinical trials. She previously served as clinical research coordinator at the Cleveland Clinic Taussig Cancer Center and now works with the University of Michigan Rogel Cancer Center. Laura has dedicated her career to helping patients and families navigate clinical trial participation, including education, consent, and side effect management with a strong focus on shared decision-making and quality of life. She is also an active leader in national oncology organizations and recognized educator and speaker in this field. Dr. Phillip, I'll hand it off to you to speak on questions to ask your oncologist, screening, eligibility, enrollment, and how to prepare for your trial.
Well, thank you very much, Annie, for this great opportunity. I was involved with Sky Foundation from the very early days, working with Sheila, so I was privileged regarding that kind of interaction I had and association. I also worked with you for a long time, Annie, and I appreciate everything you do so passionately and your dedication. So thank you for having me here. The reality is that the science has advanced so far. Molecular biology, genetics, informatics, now we have artificial intelligence. It has really resulted in an explosion of the findings that have been translated in a rapid way into new drugs in cancer. And some of the cancers we have, cancer types have made great advances in terms of patient outcomes. And now we're seeing the start of that happening in pancreatic cancer. So the key point here, the first message is that we have a lot of opportunities for new and effective drugs, taking us away from the days of just regular chemotherapy and all the side effects and the limited benefits. So we are really very excited about this. And the only way we can get these drugs to patients is through clinical trials. So this is it for a clinical trial, gives the option for the patient to be exposed for a new drug, not the typical chemo that people know about. Also, it helps us to advance the field because any information we get in treating patients with new drugs helps the next patient. That's something important sometimes we overlook. So it is very exciting to have that. However, I would like to make the point that I'll come back to it a little later. Not every patient may qualify for a clinical trial, but I know for a fact that there are a lot of patients out there who can qualify or are eligible for clinical trials. So the question is why we don't have more patients going on clinical trials. You have to remember that all the drugs we use now as a standard treatment, across the country, the world, have really gotten there after clinical trials have proven their efficacy and benefit and safety, and then the FDA and other regulatory authorities in the world have approved them. So it is important to do clinical trials. There was a recent article, and I'm happy to share it if anyone wants to read it. Still, in the United States in particular, we have a relatively low or much low contribution of clinical trials in pancreatic cancer. For multiple reasons, we can discuss that, but I don't want to, I can spend an hour talking about that. But that's another fact that you're facing, is that despite everything, despite all the new drugs coming along, we still are not putting or allowing most of our patients to be on clinical trials. Yesterday, I was asked to see two patients, second opinion, new to me, but one of them is also newly diagnosed. The other one is already under treatment somewhere else. So the first patient is someone in the mid 50s, otherwise fit guy, and he came with his wife and son. So he was recently diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and he came to me for a second opinion. Certainly, I can recommend any of the standard treatments, and we don't have many of them. That's another reason to do clinical trials, to get newer treatments. And they asked me the question of, what do you think of clinical trial? It was like a casual question. And I said, no, that's a very good question. That's an important one. And you need to consider that to go on a clinical trial. He hasn't heard from the original hospital about clinical trial option. And I said, but again, people who are looking around and checking the internet, they may get that information, but a lot of patients may not. So the next step was, how do we go about the clinical trial? I said, well, you can go on a clinical trial. One of the important things that need to be done is to see if your tumor has specific gene mutations that will make it a good reason for you to go on a clinical trial. So the gene mutations we talk about, maybe you're not familiar with. So what has happened in the last 20 years is that a lot of treatments have been developed called targeted therapies. Targeted because they pick on a specific gene mutation and becomes almost like a personalized treatment. When you get the chemotherapy, the regular chemotherapy, there's nothing personal. Everyone gets the same thing. But now, if you can pick up specific mutations in one patient, then you can direct the right treatment. Another patient may have a different mutation. They need a different mutation. So the point to make here is that patients have to really be aware and ask the oncologist, why I'm not being considered for a clinical trial. But also the oncologist has to do what we call molecular profiling. So it is profiling the tumor and the patient to see if they may qualify for something. And that has to be done very early on. And that's something which sometimes is not done early on and is left. But if it's done early on, it opens up the opportunity to be on a clinical trial. So that's a very important question to ask the oncologist. So newly diagnosed, before starting treatment. Why do I say before starting treatment? Because the clinical trials follow something called protocol. And the protocol is something which is approved by the FDA, and they're strict about following it. And one of the things about clinical trials is that you cannot put someone on an experimental clinical trial if they're already on what we call the standard or the regular treatment. So that's very important. So that was that patient. And the patient needed the molecular profiling, etc. And then they asked me a question. We are planning to go to the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. What do you think about that? My answer to that was, if you're going to get standard treatment, then you can get it anywhere. So Michigan is as good as anywhere else. And if you're looking for clinical trials, then you may not need to go to MD Anderson. You can even think of a clinical trial in Michigan, because in Michigan there are institutions, including Henry Ford, Karmanos, University of Michigan, in Grand Rapids, and other places that offer clinical trials. So getting a clinical trial is probably nowadays not as difficult before. You don't have to go far to get a clinical trial, but you can start with like Michigan. Then again, you need to know how to access that, and that's something I'm not going to discuss because I think we have excellent speaker for that. Now, the other time when you need to ask the patient about the doctor about the clinical trial is when you're already on a treatment, and that treatment has been going on 3, 4, 5, 6 months or a year, and that treatment stops working. That's the time also to immediately ask the doctor, can I go on a clinical trial? That's very important. So these are the major two times that clinical trials are important. Before starting any treatment, or you start a treatment and the treatment not working, because once you go on another line of treatment, again, takes away from you the opportunity to be on a clinical trial. So this is very important. Again, I'm stressing the value of asking the doctor at the right time, but also at the same time, you have to make sure that the doctor, from the day they started the process, that they've done the molecular profiling. Molecular profiling means that you take a piece of the tumor that was taken originally to make the diagnosis and send it to somewhere for DNA testing, RNA testing, etc. We also sometimes take blood. Always I do. I take blood to do the same thing. I also check on the patient's genetics to see sometimes some patients who have a genetic abnormality, a germline mutation like BRCA1, BRCA2, all that. Again, there will be specific treatments that will apply to the patient. So getting a second opinion if necessary is a lot of patients come with that. Now, the second patient I saw, she was a bit older. She was in her early 70s, and she was getting treatment in another facility. And now her treatment was starting to show that's not working. So she came to me for a second opinion. And I had a very similar discussion that we need to consider a clinical trial. And looking at her molecular profile, unfortunately, there wasn't something immediately that I can offer to her. But then there are other trials that she can qualify for. So she was someone who was, again, very well informed, and she was asking me the right question at the right time. So these are things that are really very important. Now, I'm going to come to the issue of the eligibility criteria in a minute, but I really emphasize the point that second opinion is important. But then again, second opinion is not enough sometimes, because, or it is enough, or it's not enough, because the issue of finding a clinical trial now has become really very extensive, because you have the whole country that you can tap into in terms of a clinical trial that's not available in an area that you're close to where you live. So that's really important. Now, when patients are considered for a clinical trial, they go through a process of screening and eligibility check. Eligibility check has nothing to do with finances or insurance. It's everything to do with the patient's medical history and how they are. So patients who have a screening process to see where they qualify for a clinical trial, they look at things like organ function, how well the liver is, how well the kidneys are working, and other things like that. But also they look into things like um, and any other comorbidities. In general, patients who are kind of very ill, those patients, they don't go on clinical trials. They're not eligible. So why is that? Why do we tell some patients you can't go on a clinical trial? Because remember, clinical trials are using new drugs or experimental agents, and you have to use them in someone who's relatively healthy and fit. You don't want to try it in someone who is sick, someone who's in bed most of the time or all the time. Those patients are also at risk of having some major side effects that we don't know of because the drug is still a new drug. Now, for pancreatic cancer, I'm just going back to the issue of clinical trials. For pancreatic cancer, all patients, 90% of the patients, have a mutation in a gene called the KRAS mutation. The KRAS mutation is present in 90% of the patients. For a long time, we were like, we don't have a drug that can target the KRAS. Now we have. We have not only one drug, we have many drugs. Drug companies are really competing to get their drugs into the market, FDA approval. So if the tumor has a KRAS mutation, which is 90% of the time, then there's no brainer nowadays. You really have to say to the doctor, I want to go somewhere where they have a drug that targets the KRAS. As simple as that. Now, you can do that before starting any treatment, or you can do it after you've been on treatment and the treatment is not working. But make sure that they do the right tests. Your oncologist does the right test to know whether you have KRAS mutation or you don't have KRAS mutation. Now, pancreatic cancer, as you know, is a disease that can sometimes change fast in terms of the patient's condition. For that reason, the eligibility criteria that are solid, they may pass a patient in the front before starting any treatment where the patient is still strong enough, but then down the road, 6, 7, 8 months later, the patients may fail the eligibility criteria because they're weaker and because the treatment has affected their organ function, etc. So something to keep in mind, because sometimes people are not eligible for reasons that their condition has changed. So the same patient may be eligible for clinical trials before starting any treatment, but later on may not be. It is important, in my opinion, that patients who are about to start a new treatment, they really take a pause and try to see whether they qualify for a clinical trial. There is a tendency for doctors and patients to want to start treatment yesterday for a disease that is really pancreatic cancer. Waiting a week or two doesn't really end up with being detrimental to the patient, week 2 or 3, but rather if you have that opportunity to see whether you qualify for a clinical trial. The other thing is that with clinical trials, as you know, sometimes there's a concern about, am I going to get a placebo? That never happens. No patient with cancer in general would get a placebo and then another patient in the same study would get the active drug. A lot of times the way clinical trials are done is that patients will get the standard of care treatment, what we normally use for that disease in that situation, and then maybe half of the patients will get the additional experimental drug and the other half will not get the experimental drug. So that's a randomized trial. Many trials are not randomized. We call them single arm. Everyone gets the experimental treatment. But those are things that make some distinctions in there's a difference in the trial design, And there's like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. That's another hour of discussion. I'll be happy to do it at any time. Um, so this is really very important to think about it that way, because that's something which patients sometimes are very concerned about. Am I going to get a placebo? No, you won't get a placebo by any means. So that will never ever happen. So this is really a very brief, but I wanted to focus on the very important points. Um, Patients, how to find clinical trials. That's always a challenge. And there are different ways the patients do it at this time. Second opinion, going to the internet. There are databases like the clinical trials, clinicaltrials.gov. The problem with all these things is that they're not as user-friendly. Patients will find it easier if they have more help from a more specialized way of looking for clinical trials. And that's also important. By the way, that also applies for doctors trying to find a clinical trial for the patient. So with that, I think I have covered
Dr.
the
Philip, if I may, let me ask you, as just before we transition to Laura Wood, I'd love to ask you a question, because you talked about the patient, the first example that you gave, you talked about the patient who had not heard about trial options from his original hospital or physician. As a physician, how would you encourage patients to ask? What would you be most receptive to as a physician if a patient were to approach you and say, "Hey, doctor, I'm interested in trials"? How should they ask that question? How would you advise a patient to ask their doctor about clinical trials, just to search for the possibility if the doctor hasn't mentioned it proactively? What would be your advice to a patient?
It's a very simple question, Mike. It's a very simple question. Is there an option for me for a clinical trial, basically? Is there an option for me for a clinical trial? And no physician should say no. And if they told you no, then ask them, why am I not, why do you think I'm not a clinical trial candidate? Because that would be a very, very direct question. And patients have to be prepared for that, either them thinking about it, or or the caregivers or the family members or friends. It's a very important aspect nowadays of patients' treatment. The patients have to ask the doctor, is a clinical trial an option for me? Because unfortunately, a lot of times that may not be offered. Part of the reason is that they want to start treatment right away. The doctors want to start treatment right away, and the patients don't want to wait another day to start treatment. But this goes part of the counseling or information provision or the education of the patient, family, and also doctors about that, because we don't do well in the United States. I can share with you the article. It's really not good compared to Europe. Now, Europe does differently for reasons I don't want to go into, but Europe does different. Europe does better than here, and there are reasons for that.
Excellent. Thank you.
So now I let Laura do her part, which I'm sure is going to be very exciting, and she can probably build on some of the things I mentioned myself. Thank you, Laura.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm delighted for the invitation to share with you some information on participating in clinical trials, and appreciate the invitation and the opportunity. And I'm going to take the opportunity to build on the great information that Dr. Philip has given you on practical tips finding and enrolling into clinical trials. So I think one of the things that we need to look at is, what is the responsibility of the oncology research team? So we're looking at safety, risk versus benefit, as Dr. Philip alluded to. That is how and why the protocol is written the way it's written. Those inclusion and exclusion criteria are put in place so that they're looking at the same patient population: newly diagnosed, previously treated. Are we going to give a drug prior to surgery? So there are various settings in which we do clinical trials, and it's important that the individuals all fit the same grouping. So it may be a similar pathology diagnosis or biomarker. same characteristics. And we're looking at safety, as mentioned previously, about organ function. Keeping in mind that typically our most fit patients are those that are newly diagnosed. And so the eligibility criteria is adjusted as patients continue through their cancer journey, because patients are often less fit later on during their journey. And so the criteria may be a little bit different. So it's looking at a drug or procedure in the specific phase of the disease. The other most important thing is making sure that the oncology research team provides you with information so that you're making an informed decision. That starts and primarily involves the informed consent, which is an ongoing process. And based on new information, you may be asked to reconsent so that you are continuing to get information on the clinical trial. It starts out with a presentation from the surgeon, the medical oncologist, the advanced practice provider on what options do you have for treatment. Standard
Hey, Laura?
treatment. Yes.
Laura, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I know you have some great slides, and I'm not sure if you meant to share them
You're
yet.
not seeing them?
We're not. So just be sure to hit that share button and pull up your slides.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Okay.
There we
Are
go.
you seeing my slides now?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So we will start from here then. And again, the safety, risk, benefit, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. The informed consent is that ongoing process. The physician or provider presents the clinical trial, and then the research team really gets in to the nuts and bolts of that informed consent document. It can be anywhere from 8 to 30 pages. Do not be overwhelmed. I tell patients, take it a chunk at a time with a yellow highlighter. It's an initial conversation. Review it, read it several times, highlight it where you have questions, and that's what a follow-up phone call for the research team member is, to go over that consent. And I'll often say, now, a key thing to look at is on page 6. What do I want to point out? There's background information. There's information on the drug or drugs being used, potential side effects based on what is currently known. What is the schedule? What is the follow-up schedule? So even when you've had that last dose of a drug, that last CAT scan, there will be follow-up. The golden rule for clinical trials is overall survival, but we're also looking at duration of treatment, duration of treatment-free interval with some of our therapies. And there may be additional tests such as quality of life, pharmacoeconomics, looking at the cost of cancer and cancer treatment, or there may be on-study biopsies that are being done. Again, looking at those biomarkers and mutations. So a lot of different things to be considered. Another important aspect from you and your loved ones is, what is the cost? What is the cost of me participating in a study? There are standard of care costs. This would be the drug that's already FDA approved, the frequency of labs or scans that are being done as part of routine cancer care. And there are those research-related costs. For example, if a drug is new and we're looking at the potential cardiac toxicities, what changes in heart function might occur, the FDA may require that echocardiograms or heart ultrasounds are done at certain times during treatment or before treatment to make sure that heart function is adequate. Those are research-related tests and will be covered by the sponsor. So Medicare is very supportive of the research, and we develop budgets to go with clinical trials to ensure that the costs are appropriate. When new information is known, new side effects, additional testing is put in place for safety, the reconsent process begins. Starts with an oral discussion, starts with a discussion. This is what we found. The consent is being rewritten. Once it is approved by our institutional review board or IRB, we will ask that you read and sign the consent to continue treatment. You also have the right at any point in time for any reason to withdraw consent from participating in a clinical trial. And that again is your right. It involves a conversation, particularly with a provider. And then you may be asked to provide some type of written documentation, simply so that they have documentation that you have requested to withdraw consent. And that's your right, and it won't impact your care. So now that we've talked about the consent and getting ready to enroll, what do you need to bring to that appointment? And I also encourage looking at clinical trials not only before you begin treatment, but during treatment. If CAT scans start to show that the disease is changing and there may be some early conversations about changing treatment, that's the key time to look at clinical trials. You want to look at what you need to bring to appointments as you prepare possibly to go somewhere else. You want to look at your medical records. You need to bring pathology reports. Again, the eligibility criteria. What type of cancer and biomarkers do you have? Any of those profiling reports. You can print them from MyChart at times, or you can contact the medical record department. What current medications and supplements are you taking? All of our oral drugs, those drugs that come in a pill form, have the potential to interact with medications you're already taking and the potential to interact with supplements. So the provider that's going to talk to you about a clinical trial needs to have that information available. Visit notes, surgery reports, hospital discharge summaries, anything that talks about you as an individual that helps them make decisions about risk, benefit, and options. The most recent lab reports, I always tell patients to get several months worth of reports because they're going to look at trends for lab results over time. What are your liver functions doing over the last 6 months? What about kidney function? Or are you anemic? Those things are very helpful, as well as copies of scan reports, CAT scans, bone scans, MRIs, PET scans. Any imaging procedure you've had done in a radiology department is very helpful. And you want to get those scans put on a CD for the new physician to look at. Now, do I have to print them? Do I have to get them advanced? It's a two-way story. Nowadays, with the electronic medical record, institutions should have the ability to share access. That comes from you. You need to provide consent to allow through the Care Everywhere system or whatever the electronic medical record, the EMR, is. You want to do that at your institution, your hospital, as soon as you start thinking about a second opinion. You want to sign that release, let the office know in your scheduling appointment that you're getting that access available, and then you want to verify that they have that before you show up for your appointment. That allows them to pull up all that information and other information that you might not have thought about to be able to have. If you have to take paper records, make several copies. One for yourself so that you have it in case you end up going to another provider. And I always ask patients to get 2 CD-ROMs because there's nothing more frustrating than popping a CD-ROM into my computer and I can't get the files to open and I can't look at your images. So 2 CD-ROMs is a good resource to have. It also allows you to leave a CD-ROM and take one back with you. So as we've talked about the different types of treatment that can be used to treat your cancer, Dr. Phillip gave some introductory information. Chemotherapy interferes with the cancer cell's ability to multiply, divide, and metastasize. Targeted therapy inhibits or blocks specific pathways or mutations that are important to a cancer cell's growth and metastasis. There's some little tricks about the naming of the drugs. There's a generic name, and then there's the trade name. So monoclonal antibodies are a class of drugs. The generic names ends with MAB, monoclonal antibody, such as bevacizumab. That's the generic name. The trade name is Avastin. Then there are also drugs that are referred to as tyrosine kinase inhibitors. These are your oral drugs that you take in a pill form. The generic name ends in inib, as in inhibitor, trametinib, larotrectinib. So those drugs that generically end in an ibid, you know, are an oral drug. Then our newer class of drugs are the immunotherapies or the immune checkpoint inhibitors. And they have been a game changer for so many cancers. And you've seen the commercials about these drugs. Immunotherapy, just like the other therapies, work differently. Immunotherapy stimulates your immune system to recognize and destroy cancer cells. So it improves the functionality of your healthy immune system, making it healthier and more effective, while interfering with the cancer cells to not be able to divide. One of the resources that the National Comprehensive Cancer Center Network, or the NCCN, has for patients are these patient guides. And I've got the website down here at the bottom. That is a very good layperson level reading material to help you understand pancreatic cancer or any of the other cancers. There are NCCN guidelines for Dr. Phillip and other providers that tell us what is currently the standard of care, what drugs may be considered, and so they help us make those treatment decisions. And now we're seeing more and more biomarkers being incorporated into approved drugs and into clinical trials. So finding the clinical trial is definitely the challenge. And the national website is clinicaltrials.gov. But I will tell you that for me personally, it's not one of the most user-friendly, be it from a professional perspective or from a caregiver perspective. I am completely impressed, and pancreatic cancer is not my cancer that I work with, but I am quite impressed with the TriCan Health website. And Kimra's going to walk you through that a little bit later about how to find clinical trials. It is very user-friendly. I'm going to investigate it. I'm looking forward to Kimya's presentation in a little bit, but you got to find it. And as Dr. Phillip alluded to, you've got family members that are asking, what can I do to help? This is something that they can do to help, particularly if you've got an older individual or an adult parent who's not so computer savvy. The adult children are an amazing resource to do the legwork with some of your medical information to be able to plug into the website. So what kind of cancer do you have? What are you looking for right now? TriCan focuses on pancreatic cancer. What type or histology is the cancer? It then gives you what your options are, and it will give you the name of the clinical trial. The most important thing you want to be aware of is, what is this NCT number that I've just highlighted? It is the National Clinical Trial Number. Every clinical trial has this unique identifier. Your oncologist and every oncologist throughout the US can Google that number and find out specifically what the clinical trial is. You'll see in the left-hand side, it talks about the treatment groups. Here it shows group 1, and it lists the drugs that are being used. And I may say, okay, I'm familiar with gemcitabine, but what's this other drug? I've never heard of one of these drugs. You can then go on a very reputable, easy-to-use website called drugs.com and Google on that website, put in the search bar, the name of the drug you see on the clinical trial website. It will tell you if that drug is already approved in another type of cancer. Every drug starts out being focused on 1 or 2 cancers. It gets approved there, and then we start looking at how that drug is used. What other cancers use that same class of drug? So, for example, this one is a platinum-resistant situation where it's being used, and now it's being used in breast cancer. It's being used in several different ones. And you'll see what is the drug's mechanism of action. That is, how does the drug work? And this is why drugs are being given in combination now, is that we're using drugs that target different pathways that destroy cancer cells' ability to multiply and divide at different time points. So we're combining chemotherapy and targeted therapy, chemotherapy and immunotherapy. And then down here at the bottom, how's the drug given? So even though the drug doesn't end in inib, this is an oral drug, and this tells you how you're taking it. So that information is a good resource for you as well. So with that, I thank you for your time. I thank again for the opportunity, and I look forward to answering questions with Dr. Phillip.
That's fantastic, Laura. Thank you very much. I particularly appreciate understanding the drug names with the suffix at the end, because I've never quite, certainly I can't pronounce any of them, and I can certainly appreciate now what at least I'm looking at with a type of drug. So thank you for sharing that. What I would like to do is invite you both up as you are for sort of live discussion, and I'll put it in the context of a patient or their clinician that's looking for trial options. So one of the things that you both highlighted are, Dr. Phillip, you mentioned, where are clinical trials available? Start in Michigan, but by all means, you can look anywhere across the country. Laura, you were just talking about the idea of being newly diagnosed, understanding if surgery is an option and so forth. So let's do kind of a real life example, and I'll walk you through and then maybe ask some questions as we go through it. So what I'm sharing right now is TriCanHealth.com. It's free and accessible to anybody across the country. All actively recruiting clinical trials for pancreatic cancer are listed on here. All the original source of information is that clinicaltrials.gov site, which is the National Clinical Trial Registry. So all things are there. And you might have seen this view in Laura's presentation a moment ago. What I'll walk through is a typical example. Obviously, it doesn't fit every single patient, but often what patients present with is something called pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma. And because we need acronyms for everything, this is often called PDAC. So this is a common one. So we'll select that type of cancer and we'll just say next. So again, this is a patient that might be interested, or the patient's adult child that's interested in helping to understand what trial options there are. And we'll say this person is in, say, Jackson, Michigan, and they are looking for trials that might be near them. And, there might be something where their physician said, well, we told you what stage of cancer it is, but you might not remember what they said, or they might have used different words. So you might say, hey, listen, I just don't know. And that's an option on this site, is to say, I don't know. And then you can advance to the next question. And perhaps your doctor said, instead of saying it was, stage 4, they might have used the word metastatic, for example, or locally advanced or regionally advanced. Whatever they might have indicated, you can point that out here on the site. And you can always go back and change your answers and so forth and get different results if you want. And this was an important point, which is not only is I think the term was histology, right? The type of cancer that you have. So in this case, that PDAC option. And then there's what are the treatments that you've had to this point. So have you had traditional chemotherapy? Have you had radiation? Have you had surgery and so forth? Those are answers that you can provide here. We'll assume that this hypothetical patient has had chemotherapy. And we'll even identify what type of chemotherapy they've had. And Dr. Phillip mentioned that there are a number of standard of care options. The ones that we encounter very often are fluorouracil or FOLFIRINOX, which are combinations. And there are other ones that are always evolving in terms of combinations of these different chemotherapies. We'll choose FOLFIRINOX for this simple example. And then, Laura, I think you mentioned understanding, would this be happening before or after surgery? That affects what particular trial might or might not be appropriate. And we'll say, in this case, I just don't know. I don't know if my doctor didn't explain if surgery is an option or not. I don't remember that. So you can click, I don't know, and you can still move forward. The last question that this site asks of patients is, do you have any biomarkers or genetic risks? And Dr. Phillip, you mentioned something, and I want to ask you to elaborate just for a moment on this, which is you mentioned molecular profiling and understanding that, if I'm not mistaken, and clarify if I'm wrong, but molecular profiling in that context is really talking about the genetic profile of the tumor tissue itself, not the germline genetics of every cell in the person's body. Can you just explain that differentiation for us for a moment?
So I'm going to expand on this question and tell you exactly what I do in clinic. So there's something we call it somatic, which is the tumor itself. What's the DNA in the tumor? And there's something called germline, which is every single cell in the body carries that mutation. That's something you are born with. We are interested in both, actually. So in my clinic, when I see a new patient, I do three things. One is the piece of the tissue that was used for diagnosis, I send that for molecular profiling. That's a somatic.
Mm-hmm.
But in pancreatic cancer patients, approximately 20% or 30%, depending on which hospital, where, and what, you may not have enough tissue, enough cells to give you a good comprehensive look at the molecular profile. For that reason, I also do the blood for something called circulating tumor DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Circulating tumor DNA. So the same DNA that is being shed out of the tumor itself. And then I also do a test called germline testing, where they take the normal cells. We used to take the lining of the mouth, but now we do the lymphocytes, another blood test, which looks at the germline. So the germline meaning that were you born with a gene mutation? Because if you're born with a gene mutation, there are some treatments also we can modify accordingly, but also we can give advice regarding first degree relatives who have to be checked because you carry the gene. BRCA1, BRCA2 are the most famous ones.
Got it.
So
And
basically, I mitigate the 20-30% failure with the somatic mutation by relying on the tumor itself by doing a blood test. Now, you can always say, have another biopsy done. Well, that means another biopsy doing. I don't want to do that. I'm doing the blood.
Understood. Perfect. Thank you. So in this example, what we'll assume is that they have this genetic mutation, this inherited mutation, this germline mutation of BRCA1, BRCA2, and something that is within the tumor itself, a KRAS mutation. So we'll make the assumption for this hypothetical patient, and we'll say next. And what this platform does is it searches then for someone that has this PDAC, this particular type of cancer, around Jackson, Michigan, with metastatic disease. They've had chemotherapy before, specifically FOLFIRINOX, with a BRCA1, BRCA2 mutation and a KRAS mutation. And what it shows is that in priority of what's closest to you near Jackson, what are the 15 trials for which this patient might qualify? Now, Laura and Dr. Phillip, you know that there are many other things that need to be qualified, like kidney function, like overall health levels and so forth. You mentioned these in your presentations. So it doesn't cover every single question, but it gets you most of the way there. What we call in TriCan is we want to get you on a date. We don't necessarily have to get you married. We just want to get you to start having the helpful conversation with your oncologist to say, listen, is this an option and are these of interest to us? So what this example does, and this highlights the point, Dr. Phillip, you mentioned that you can start in Michigan. So here's a trial that's here in Chelsea, Michigan, but in Ann Arbor, of course, but 255 other locations all around the country for this particular trial. Whereas others might be located in just a few locations nearby. And here you'd have to go to Ohio for this particular trial if you wanted this particular, therapy. So very interesting to see these ones. Yes, sir.
Can I make a comment? Just
Please.
a quick one. So you may see a trial that is open, let's say, in Grand Rapids.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why you may not be able to get it at Grand Rapids is that these clinical trials open, they call it slots, few empty slots where they can fill with patients, and then they stop and see how the patients are doing before putting more patients. Or because these trials are done across the country, each center may be given a few slots that they can put their new patients in. So there are reasons. So if you have a study that's that's available in Michigan, doesn't mean 100% you'll be able to be on it. That's why keeping the options open outside of Michigan is important.
That's a great point. Thank you. So let me just highlight a couple things. Laura, you mentioned, and I think Dr. Phillip, you did too, the idea of targeted therapy, right? So this idea of more personalized medicine based on your particular situation. And you can see here that these trials, these first 3, 4, 5 are all targeted therapies, whereas this one combines a targeted therapy with a form of chemotherapy. So in our site, we've highlighted this so that you can rapidly identify what types of therapies do we want. And in fact, if you want to get fancy, you can say on the trial treatment type, I only want to look for things that have targeted therapies, and I'll filter out the other ones. And you see one of them only had a different type of therapy. So these are just the ones that include some form of targeted therapy. One other filter that we can apply, because you all mentioned this, is have you had treatment before? Have you had this type of chemotherapy? We might say, for this one, we're going to say on line of therapy, we're going to say this is only for someone that's on second line therapy, meaning that they have had treatment for something else previously, and then we can further narrow down the results. For any one of these, we can highlight the particular trial, see where it's located, or see the additional locations around the country. To your point, Dr. Phillip, if they're not enrolling right away in Ohio, they might be in Indiana, or they might be out here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I enroll patients in this particular type of trial. And something that you mentioned, Laura, is understanding if a particular medication can be given via pill. And this one, in fact, shows that treatments in this study are given via pill and can be taken at home, as opposed to having to be in the hospital for an IV. So some interesting information that's available on each of these trials that would help anyone identify the right option. Dr. Phillips.
So the reason why we stress to start in Michigan is that if you go to, let's say, MD Anderson in Texas, direct flight from Detroit, if you are enrolled on a clinical trial, then they will be doing everything. It's not like you come back and they send the drug to your doctor to give it. It has any treatment that is given as a clinical trial, it has to be done by the hospital that signs you up for the clinical trial.
That's
You
right.
have to keep that in mind.
Totally agreed. And the last thing I'll show before we prepare to close the conversation today is just if you wanted to be even more restrictive on location. So we said that this patient were located in Jackson, and we've looked within a radius of 300 miles, but that's quite a drive. So if this person said, you know what, I don't want to drive more than 120 miles or thereabouts, great. Then we can highlight that there's actually 9 trials that fit all these criteria. And that becomes a great discussion to have with your oncologist to say, listen, these might be of interest. So you can highlight a trial. You can say, you know what, I want to share this with my doctor. You can copy a link or download a PDF or email them directly. And you can share that with your physician and say, can we have a conversation, please? Just as you suggested, Dr. Phillip, what do you think about clinical trials, either at the start of treatment or after your treatment stops working and it's time to consider what might be your next path? It's a great opportunity to discuss these trials. Yes, Laura.
So if you can scroll down just a little bit, I think the other important thing to be aware of is if you look over here on the right side below the map, this gives you the contact information for that institution for that clinical trial. It tells you who the principal investigator is. That means who's the physician in charge. But more importantly, there's a phone number there.
Yep.
That gives you a phone number that you can call to say, hey, I have my liver tests are not 100% normal, or I have had specific treatment medications. You can call them and get more definitive information on whether you're potentially eligible or not. So that's a good question in the process of considering going there to have a further detailed discussion.
Terrific point. Listen, thank you for answering many of the questions that I had, not all, but got through a large number of them. And thank you for the excellent presentations. I'll turn it over to Annie to close us out, please.
Thank you guys so much, Dr. Phillip, Laura, thank you. Such valuable information that you shared with us today. I wish I could have you guys on every time. You were so great. Thank you so much. And thank you to those who were able to join us. Our next session will happen 2 weeks from today, and the topic will be a patient perspective. We'll have 2 survivors on with us to talk about their experience with clinical trials and hopefully give others some valuable advice. So we hope you'll join us again. On behalf of Sky Foundation and TriCan Health, thank you for being here and taking the time to learn more about your options. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.